Good morning. This is June 26th, and as we realize, there's all this Russian stuff swirling around, but as you also know from listening to the news, it's changing hour by hour, so I won't talk about it today, and we'll see how that unravels and then talk about it down the road. Today, my topic is China and India. Um, why am I talking about China and India? Because much is going on with both of those countries in US policy. And as you might have noticed, there is a lot of criticism, bad mouthing, attacks on China on the part of US policymakers, on the part of members of Congress of various kinds, and China is, even the President of the United States called Xi a dictator the other day, which indeed he may be, but it's a separate issue as to whether a president of one country should call another one a dictator and under what circumstances. And then there was the visit of Modi from China and big celebrations, fancy dinners to welcome him as a fellow Democrat. And I want to sort of disaggregate both of these things a little bit. Now, what we do know is that both of those are the biggest countries in the world. India has just overtaken China in terms of the size of the population by a little bit. And both of them have huge populations and important economies. Economies which the US and other Western countries are linked into through trade and investments and so on. So they are important players in the world. The fact that they're also maybe important players in world affairs in different parts of the world is maybe where I want to start. And let me start with China. China, since the revolution, since Mao, spent decades really not getting terribly involved in the rest of the world. It didn't try to export its ideology. It was not terribly linked economically. And as it became economically linked through investments, through trade, through the Road and Belt Initiative of making loans to countries to build infrastructure between China and through Asia and so forth, China increasingly got involved economically and in terms of development aid. I have mentioned before that one of the things that's of interest right now is that for many countries, including Latin American countries, by the way, China has become the main trading partner. So there's no question that China has, over the last decade or decade and a half, become increasingly relevant economically to many of the countries of the world. But the fact that China is now involved politically is in fact a new phenomenon. One of the interesting things about China historically has been that it didn't involve itself in other people's politics or in international affairs. But as you may have seen in the news, China is mediating various disputes in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between other Middle East countries. And so all of a sudden, within the last year or two, China is involving itself in diplomacy, not just direct economic activity, but in diplomacy in various parts of the world. So in this sense, China in the last few years has become a major world actor, not just economically, not just in terms of trade, but also in terms of its political engagement, when it studiously avoided political engagement over the years. Now, quickly turning to India, India now supposedly is the most populous country in the world. And unlike China, which has had a dictatorship of one kind or another since the revolution, it is heralded as the biggest democracy in the world. And that needs to be carefully examined because in many ways, India has been a bustling democracy. It is a very complicated country. Under Nehru, the first post-colonial prime minister, it set up democratic institutions and all the rest. And to this day, they have national elections. And the question is India really a democracy the way our press and our government seems to feel? Well, I would like to propose to you that while India in many ways is a democracy and certainly distinctive from the Chinese political system right now, it probably should be declared one of the illiberal democracies, as, for example, Hungary, and one could even as Poland. That is to say, the format is elections, but what actually happens underneath once their election has taken place, or even elections which don't really have serious competition or are unfair in terms of the competition. That is to say, the competition can't really win elections due to various obstacles put in their way. It's not exactly a democracy in the way that Western Europe or the United States thinks of itself as a democracy. So the distinction about China being a dictatorship and India being this burgeoning, huge democracy that we want to ally ourselves with is in some senses a distortion. And where India will be going politically in the next few years is far from clear. There will be an election next year in India, and Modi is no doubt going to win the election, not because he is tamping down opposition, but the opposition, which used to be the party that the Gandhis of various generations ran, is in total disarray. So in that sense, it is a foregone conclusion that Modi will be reelected, in his case, because, as I said, the opposition is not strong enough to win elections. Now, the other thing to be said about the two societies is that China is really sort of holistic in some aspects of its culture. One of the smart things, I suppose, that Mao and the Mao administration did was to declare that all the Chinese language should be uniform throughout the country. That does not mean that various groups in various parts of China don't also have local languages and local dialects, but nationally, there is no question that China is operating with a single language, and that this would tie the Chinese society and politics together. In the case of India, the common language was the colonial language, namely English, and that was kept, Nehru kept it consciously so as to give an umbrella language which would tie the country together rather than splitting up into Hindi and Bengali and all these other various kinds of languages. Now, what's interesting about this is that while English is still formally the national language of India, you might have noticed that when Modi was in Washington, D.C., and there was a press conference, etc., he was actually speaking in Hindi rather than English. That would have been the first prime minister, I believe, if I'm accurate, to do that. That is to say, the nationalism of Hindus, and therefore Modi, who is a Hindu in India, and the Hindi language, the Hindu language, is increasingly, out of a nationalistic Hindu sense, taking dominance. And I think Modi very much wanted to demonstrate we're not an English-speaking country, we're a Hindi-speaking country. But of course, many people in India don't actually speak Hindi, right? That is not their language. So the common language is certainly of educated people up until relatively recently tended to be English. And it's still true that in the education system in India, people learn English in universities and all the rest. But there are stark differences. That is to say, the idea of China, we're a Mandarin-speaking country, and everything formal is in Mandarin, versus India, which used to have the umbrella of English, which is now increasingly through the nationalist Hindi government of Modi, morphing into Hindi, are some serious differences. The centralization of China is obvious to all of us, but it still is the case that local governments have a fair amount of leeway, not in opposing the central government, but in managing their local affairs. In India, increasingly, the central state is trying to control things. In some ways, this is a good thing, for example, a national banking and insurance system and so on. But in other ways, of course, it tries to undermine localities and diminish the status of the non-Hindi speakers. Then let me quickly rattle on and say it is, of course, the case that there is strong opposition in China to various cultural differences, even though they do exist in different parts of China. In India, until Modi came along, that used to be celebrated. And one thing that China and India has in common is their objection and opposition to Islam. We have talked about the Uyghurs in the north, which are strongly discriminated against. And we know many of them are in labor camps and there are human rights issues. In the case of India, Modi's discrimination against Muslims and his record before he became prime minister, which involved what the U.S. and the international community called human rights violation, because mosques were burned and Muslims were killed. And Modi was deeply involved. You might have heard on news conferences, or at least on the news when Modi was visiting, that Modi was actually banned from coming to the United States because of his involvement of human rights violations of Muslims. And nowadays, that's sort of forgotten, and he was welcomed with fanfare in Washington. But both countries are concerned about Muslims and are discriminating against China nationally. And in the case of India, it is Modi's bête noire, so to speak, to oppose Islam and to highlight we are a Hindu nation, and this is what we stand for. So what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that on the one hand, there are huge differences between China and India. On the other hand, we in U.S. policy and in the press sort of say China bad, India good. And it is in many ways a very much more mixed picture. On the other hand, both countries are playing hugely more important roles in world affairs. I already talked about China being involved increasingly in world affairs. India had a similar pattern. That is to say, under many Indian governments, India did not get itself involved in world affairs at all. It had a very small foreign service, shockingly small foreign service, which was of some interest. And it had very little involvement and representation elsewhere. Well, that is rapidly changing. That is to say, India is trying to play a more prominent role in world affairs. It hasn't gotten to the point where it tries to mediate, let's say, disputes in the Middle East, but you can tell that Modi's outreach is really to say, along with our increasing economic activities worldwide, and we are in fact, reaching out and trying to have a more prominent role in world affairs. That comes into play with the relationship of both countries to Russia, which is relevant because of among other things, because of the current Russian situation. Um, Xi has said Russia is our friend, and he's met with Putin, and he's even gone so far as in recent days to say, we support our Russian friends, and we oppose, up, incursions or opponents and so forth. That is, of course, also of self-interest, because surely she is not interested in any kind of uprising or subgroups forming in China. So in part, he is expressing the interest that central governments should be in control, and you shouldn't have mercenaries running around doing your bidding. And then, as in the case of Russia, then objecting to what the government in Putin's government is doing. So it makes a lot of sense for China to be supportive of ongoing support of Putin. India's involvement in the case of Russia is essentially economic. And it's getting, it's oil, and it's getting it cheaply. It is getting much of the Indian military comes from Russia. That is to say, the military hardware is purchased from Russia. It's true that India is trying to change that slightly and diversify, but there's a lot of interdependence because of oil, for example, which India is still heavily dependent on with Russia. Now, the fact that in contrast to China, which says Russia is our ally, India, of course, doesn't say Russia is our ally so much as we are neutral. And India's neutrality actually goes back way far, all the way back to Nehru, in the days of the hottest Cold War, when India was at the forefront of being one of the group of non-aligned countries. So India has always taken the position that it doesn't really want to take a position between the warring parties of the Cold War. And at this point, it doesn't want particularly to take a position against Russia with respect to the West in the Ukrainian war. It can make noises that it doesn't believe countries should be fighting or incursions should be taking place, but it is essentially trying to be mute and taking a neutral position, a non-aligned position. And from both India's history, that seems very historically rational, and it even seems rational now, given its interdependence for energy and other still arms. Although India is trying to diversify now by Western arms, you might have noticed that in the news conferences with Modi here, he's now going to buy American arms as well. So, two very different countries, both of them trying to play a new role in world affairs, both of them having not a long history of trying to play a role in world affairs, both of them taking the opportunity of saying most of the world is, our trading partners. We get natural resources from most of the world. And we are not aligned with the warring parties of the United States and Western Europe and the Russians. That has made itself manifest in the United Nations, where condemning Russian incursions in Ukraine and human rights violations and so forth can't get anywhere, because both China and Russia sit on the Security Council and can veto anything. And that is, generally speaking, a problem for international institutions, because China and Russia are members of most of them, and they have both the historical power, let's say the veto power or the votes, and also the economic power to undermine the activities of the post-World War II international institutions, all the UN agencies, the New York headquarters in New York, in terms of taking strong actions, either against anything the Russians are doing, or for that matter, anything the Chinese are doing with respect to human rights violations amongst the Uyghurs. So, what am I trying to say here? The first thing I'm trying to say is that the idea of the U.S., whether it's members of Congress or the Central Administration, painting China bad guy, India good guy, is both ill-advised and, if you look more deeply, somewhat inaccurate. It is true that India and the United States have more in common than China in some ways, sort of historically and in ideology and politics to some extent. But it is also the case that the U.S. is deeply engaged with China economically, in terms of technology and all the rest, and is also, in many ways, deeply involved through technology and all the rest with India. So, if you want to compute American interests, it would be not to overreact and not to badmouth and not to develop an ideology of good guys and bad guys, but take both relationships as being rather complex and requiring the most knowledgeable and best intentions of the two superpowers for the 20th century. As we have discussed in the past, U.S. influence around the world is waning in many ways, and most countries are calculating their interests in terms of who are their trading partners, who are their investment partners, and both China and India increasingly are very important. China is way ahead of India in terms of investments all over the world, but still in terms of trade. Now, there's a different kind of component, which is a human component, and that is the U.S. and many other countries are also tied to India through their diaspora. Indians are really all over the world. The general statistics are between 18 and 20 million Indians are part of the Indian diaspora. What does that mean? Indians, high-tech Indians, Indian doctors, including many in the United States and in England and all over Europe, but also at the lower end, Indian labor in many countries in the world. For example, there are many blue-collar workers of Indian extraction, on temporary contracts very often, throughout the Gulf states in the Middle East and many other parts of the world. So India has been supplying labor on the one hand to many countries at the low end, and highly educated technology people, physicians, scientists, and so forth at the high end. So the interweaving of Indians in the rest of the world is far different and far greater than the interweaving of mainland Chinese. Now, you will rapidly say, well, aren't there a lot of Chinese living in the United States? That is absolutely the case. But the Chinese living in the United States, on the whole, were people who left China to escape China at one time or another, or the government right now, and were in a sense kind of refugees of one kind or another from China, who are making a permanent life in the countries that they are living in. So, for example, most of the Chinese in the United States are Asian Americans, that is to say they're American citizens. They're not temporary guest workers, and they're not temporary diaspora people. They may be very much imbued with their language and their culture and all the rest of it, of their Chinese, if they are first generation, or if they're second and third generation, their heritage. But that's very different than temporary Chinese workers that are spread throughout the world. There are Indians, I'm sorry. There are Indians really, the part of diaspora, really literally all over the world, all over Africa. There are Indians. And in the case of the British colony, it attracted Indians who actually, for example, in the case of Kenya, became citizens, and Uganda. But during the era of Idi Amin, he kicked all the Indians out and took away their citizenship, and they wound up being refugees in England and other countries. It is also the case that both India and China send many students to study in the West. At the moment, there's a reduction of the number of Chinese students studying in the United States, which I would editorialize to say this is not a good thing. That is to say, the U.S. throwing obstacles against Chinese coming to study here to both undergraduate and graduate work is a very bad idea, because when people study overseas, they pick up all kinds of things. Knowledge of that society, which is helpful when they go back, linkages with human beings, developing possibly some new attitudes, and so forth. So reducing the number of foreign students is a very bad idea for the United States and other countries. In terms of Indians, there are still a large number of Indians who come to study in the United States. Some stay, some go back home. Some go back and forth. Some are dual citizenship. And even there, by our sort of more conservative politics under Trump and right-wing political operatives in the United States, condemning and making the obstacles for Indian physicians, for example, nurses and so forth, to get visas to come to the United States is really, really very bad. Many have lost their stay in the U.S. They've had to go back home. This means that small hospitals, for example, in the Middle West, all of a sudden lose their doctors, etc. So the sort of anti-foreign elements in the United States, the China bashing in the United States, the racism on the part of the United States against both Chinese and Indians is not only not in the interest of U.S. foreign policy, but is not in the interest of our own society, which needs people. Now, finally, let me say that we know that China is an aging society and will have a shortage of labor in this century and will have to import labor. India is a much younger society, and that gives it a boost because it will not need foreign labor, certainly not in the next few decades. So in some ways, the Indian economy, if it continues to make progress, is very much better position of being able to deal with its domestic workforce than the Chinese will be. But that's another and more complicated topic. Now, the one thing that I want to end on is to say that whatever one may think and however one may disagree with what I have said, India and China are absolutely necessary if we in the United States and the rest of the globe can do something about climate change. They absolutely need to be part of the climate change policies and the urgent need to bring everybody on board before it's too late. And if one is looking for a way to deal with governments, be they Chinese or be they Indians, which puts on the back burner some of the differences, the one diplomatic leverage is climate. And the U.S. and both China and India must cooperate on climate and must put their ideological oppositions to the politics or the human rights or any other aspects in those societies a little bit on the back burner. That is not to say we should not speak up when there are human rights violations, but to paint countries in a corner by saying, China is a dictatorship and China is bad, as the Trump administration has done, and to some extent, even the Biden administration, is not in the interest of the survival of us all in terms of climate change. So a more nuanced, a more informed policy about both countries and removing the sort of ideological China bad guy, India good guy, is not in the interest of the United States and all of us who live in this country. Thank you very much for listening. Talk again a couple of weeks from now.